Hi, welcome back to the playlist on the pentose phosphate pathway. What I want to do in this video is I want to use a real world example of something that may have happened to you in the past. And I want to use this real world example to illustrate really the purpose of the pentose phosphate pathway. And I'm assuming that you've already watched the previous two videos, okay? I'm assuming you've already watched those. And so what I want to do is I want to use a real world example. Let's say, let me get my brush. Okay. Let's say, here's your leg, right? Here's your leg, right? And there's, here's your knee right here. And let's say you're running and you fall and you got like some kind of cut on your knee, right? You got a cut, you've got a wound, a gash or whatever. And I said, what's going to be the best way to heal it? Well, if you think about what has to happen, and I'm assuming you've already had at least some biology, well, you're going to have cells divide, right? Eventually, you're going to have cells divide, right? So that's going to be your mitosis, right? That's your M phase of the cell cycle, right? But if you think about it, what has to happen before mitosis? Well, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but you have the G1 phase, you have the S phase, you have the G2 phase, and ultimately that leads to mitosis, right? What I want to focus in on right now is I want to focus in on the S phase. And if you remember your biology or your physiology, what happens in the S phase is DNA synthesis, and specifically it's DNA replication. So you have the action of DNA polymerase that's actively replicating the DNA so that the cells can divide. So ultimately what's happening with that wound is the cells are dividing to help regenerate the cells to ultimately regenerate your epidermis. And if it went into the dermis, which it probably did if it's bleeding, to regenerate the dermal cells and all that good stuff. Okay, so DNA synthesis is occurring. And you don't really have to know anything about DNA synthesis at this point, but what I want to do is I want to ask you, what potentially could accelerate that healing at least a little bit more? And what I want to do is let's say you're eating a healthy diet, and really in a healthy diet, most of your calories should come from amino acids. So let's say you're eating not necessarily no sugar, but you're eating a low glycemic diet to avoid insulin spikes and all that good stuff, right? And let's say I want to heal this wound, right? Well, what's going to be the environment that's probably going to be good for healing a wound? And so if I asked you this, based on your knowledge so far, what you should say is fueling the pentose phosphate pathway, right? Well, let's look at this, right? I'm not going to draw structures in this video. If you need to see structures, you can go back to the previous two videos. But essentially, I've got glucose, right? I've got glucose. And glucose ultimately gets converted to glucose 6-phosphate, right? And then the glucose 6-phosphate goes through the oxidative phase of the pentose phosphate. So here's oxidative phase, right? And out of the oxidative phase comes 2-NADPH, right? 2-NADPH. And then at the very end of the oxidative phase, we have what? We have ribose. We have ribose 5-phosphate, right? And I mentioned that the ribose 5-phosphate can get consumed by another enzyme, and that enzyme was called PRPP synthetase, right? PRPP synthetase. And of course, that generates phosphoribosyl pyrophosphate. And then I mentioned that PRPP goes to the synthesis of, basically that the main thing is it goes to the synthesis of nucleic acids. It goes to the synthesis of nucleic acids. And so my question to you is, knowing all this stuff, right? Knowing all this information, what would you want to do in order to have an environment that would effectively heal this wound? Well, in order for the cells to divide, it has the cell cycle ultimately has to go through the S phase, the DNA synthesis phase. And what I'll go ahead and tell you is that in general, the cell doesn't keep a whole lot of nucleoside triphosphates around. And so what it's going to have to do is it's going to have to constantly synthesize nucleic acids, and that's, of course, ATP, or in the case of DNA, deoxy-ATP, deoxy-GTP, deoxy-CTP, deoxy-TTP. Is going to have to synthesize all these nucleotide triphosphates. So ultimately, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have a lot of phosphoribosyl pyrophosphate. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to really fuel the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway, right? So what's going to be the environment that's going to favor that? Well, what you're probably going to want to do, and let me actually give you, you can pause the video and see if you can figure out what you want to do, right? What you probably want to do is you want to eat a little bit more glucose, right? You want to eat a little bit more glucose. So some of the glucose that you eat is going to go towards glycolysis, right? It's going to go towards glycolysis. Some of it, if you eat too much of it, might go towards glycogenesis, but a good portion of it is going to go into the pentose phosphate pathway, right? And not only that, in the oxidative phase, we produce 2-NADPH, and that also goes toward biosynthesis. That goes towards biosynthesis, not just of nucleic acids, but of other things as well that you need for the cell to live. So you eat a little bit more glucose, right? And you get the glucose 6-phosphate into the pentose phosphate pathway, right? And ultimately, you get phosphoribosyl pyrophosphate and ultimately nucleic acids, right? Okay, so this is just really a practical example of what you know now. You know the pathway of the oxidative phase. You know the pathway of the non-oxidative phase, so now it's really just application. If I want my cells to divide, they have to go through DNA replication. And to undergo DNA replication, I have to have a large supply of nucleotide triphosphates. So specifically, the nucleic acids we're talking about are deoxy-ATP, deoxy-ATP, deoxy-TTP, deoxy-GTP, and deoxy-CTP, right? And when we look at the mechanism of DNA polymerase, we'll understand why it has to be that, right? But essentially, you have all these nucleotide triphosphates you have to make, and you have to have phosphoribosyl pyrophosphate to make them. And so what you probably want to do if you're trying to heal a pretty, nasty wound is you probably want to intake a little bit more glucose. And I'm not saying, go hog wild on candy or something, that's going to cause more problems because of insulin spikes. But you probably want to eat maybe a little bit more of something like a sweet potato, or maybe some healthy, fruit or something like an apple or something. You probably want to intake a little bit more of that stuff, right? And the reason you want to intake more of it is because that glucose is going to get turned into glucose 6-phosphate, and ultimately a lot of it's going to get put into the pentose phosphate pathway, and then it's going to generate ribose 5-phosphate, and then that's going to get consumed by PRPP synthetase, and of course, as we saw, that hydrolyzes ATP to what? AMP, right? And then you generate phosphoribosyl pyrophosphate, and that can be used in the synthesis of deoxynucleotide triphosphates, right? So what have we seen? Well, if I have a wound, I've got to fuel my DNA replication. So intake a little bit more glucose, and you've got the recipe ultimately for synthesis of PRPP. So I hope this video helped you get a little more intuition on exactly what this pathway is used for. Certainly we looked at the purpose of the non-oxidative pathway, but I hope this video gave you an intuitive sense of the oxidative part. See you in the next video.